Thank you. I'll be now passing the call to senators to ask questions. I believe we have 3 senators with questions, so I'll be seeking to maintain the call in that order. But Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. I might start with Dr. Howe. Is it? Yep, Dr. Howe. She might help me solve a question I've had. There seems to be this different figures about how many babies born, or how many babies that I should say go through a late-term abortion are born alive. You've quoted one of the studies there that had the figure of 50%, but I think you said that study there was no feticide administered before. So would that typically, in your view, be the reason why some statistics seem to have a higher rate of survival than others? So we went through some statistics with the early witness in Victoria. It seems to be about 10% end up in baby born alive, but presumably maybe they are administering something before the birth. Does that explain the situation, you think?
I think that's correct. So that academic study was a study of 241 infants where potassium chloride hadn't been injected into the baby's heart to ensure fetal death prior to delivery. And in that study, over half were born alive. In Australia, we don't have national guidelines around whether feticide would occur prior to a termination. And so, for example, in the case of Jessica Jane, the coroner's report goes through the fact that in that situation, because they thought they were delivering a baby that was earlier in age, the doctor didn't give an order of feticide, and so Nurse Williams, who delivered the baby, was shocked to see a baby that was older than expected and who indeed was breathing and alive. So yes, that's correct. That is a key difference as to the amount or extent to which this happens. But we do actually have raw data which proves that this happens at a numerical level. Like, we know that 724 babies have been born alive and left to die without legal rights in Victoria and Queensland since 2010. So we don't even need to talk about this in terms of percentages. We know that there are places around the country, hospitals, which are intended to care for human beings where human beings are not receiving care because of a gap in our law.
Where was that study, the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, that study, the 241, where was that?
So my understanding is that was in the US. So it's from the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and it was, I think, a US cohort. But right. I could take that on notice to check for you.
And we don't have... you've gone through the data, and thank you very much for the data you provide. Your submission is very helpful. We don't have any data that would indicate when or how often feticide is performed before a late-term abortion.
Yep, no, we don't have that data. Yeah, right. I've looked through that, and we don't have clear information from any of the states or territories as to when that occurs. We can see in the Queensland Termination of Pregnancy Guidelines that it is expected after 22 weeks, but that's not the case in every state and territory. And we can see that, given that babies are being born alive and left to die in Victoria and Queensland, we can see that obviously feticide isn't being given universally.
Okay. I think in one of the submissions here, and now I'm going to get confused with so many people here, but anyone can comment on this, but I'm sure one of the submissions here has made the point that mothers should be, in their view, given information about what's likely to happen, the potential, whether the baby survives, etc., the proportion of that case. Can you take me through to the extent, does that happen at all anywhere in Australia right now, in your view, or is it required in any jurisdiction?
So my understanding is that it is not required to inform women that the baby that they that they're aborting could be born alive. And in fact, in my submission, I talk about another study in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which says that many women do change their minds about an initial abortion decision, and applicants over 18 weeks gestation, 75% decide to continue with their pregnancy. And in this study and in other research, it shows that if women were given information that the fetus could be born alive, that would alter the decision that they would make. And in fact, in my submission, I quote another study of just it's a single case study of a woman who went in for a late-term abortion, and she took the abortion the initial abortion pills to induce the late-term abortion and delivery. And then she changed her mind and decided that she wanted to keep her baby. And so then she presented back to the hospital and the baby was born alive, and she fought with the doctors to get medical care for that baby. And eventually, a couple of months later, that mother and baby were discharged and the baby was healthy. And that case study that's in that journal, which is in my submission, I think demonstrates the fact that this is often very vulnerable women who are grappling with very difficult circumstances. The main driver of abortion is socioeconomic circumstances, and we need to address the vulnerability that women face, financial vulnerability and others, domestic violence situations. But that, yes, if they are given proper information, they often do change their mind. And there's no requirement for that information right now, Senator.
And then just on the issue we've been raising here in the Love Adelaide submission, there's a discussion here about your submission about the use of potassium chloride. You say that the practice in Australia, to our knowledge, has been discontinued. What do you base it on? There seems to be different views here about the use of potassium chloride. What exactly happens in late-term abortions in Australia?
This information is very hard to come by. So I think that was said to us by a doctor, but we hold that very loosely because we don't have, well, we would like this information to come forward as to exactly what's going on. But I would like to speak back just quickly into the why feticide sometimes and other times not. So I've got a very personal experience of having delivered a stillborn baby at nearly 38 weeks. And then from there, I was actually part of SANS, which is stillbirth and neonatal death support, as a support worker for 15 years. So I've sat with hundreds of people who have had their babies die, mostly in utero. But there was a time where we actually joined the support group with those who had had what was classified a genetic termination. Now, those women, it's a very different from what my experience, those who are having a genetic termination to somebody who's
Could
choosing...
you explain what's a genetic termination?
Where they've been told that there's a congenital anomaly.
Okay, yep, understand.
Now, it might be these women are being told that their child is not compatible with life.
Right, yep.
The stories I've heard are exactly those words, not compatible with life, that their child is suffering, that if they continue the pregnancy to full term, it's more dangerous to their health as the mother. These are the stories that I've heard in these support groups over and over. Now, those mothers, none of those babies were ever given the feticide because that mother could not cope with that. She would not be able to cope with seeing a lethal injection coming towards her baby. She wants her baby and she wants her baby to be well and alive. And so she's going in to, in her mind, deliver early her baby who's already going to die. And she is told that there is a likelihood that her child may survive the delivery because they know there's no feticide. It's a very different situation to what's happening in the cases where somebody is wanting to terminate outside of that situation, potentially socioeconomic situations where the feticide is given. Those women don't want to see their babies afterwards, which is what happened to the story that I read out.
If I could just get one more question. My mind's been blown a bit this morning by this. So if there's no intervention, if there's no like feticide, or I don't know the details here, but there's no intervention, there's a late-term abortion, the baby's just induced and born. I mean, when they're 25, 30 weeks, there's a good chance they survive or can be viable. So is the process we're going through, we just leave the baby to die? That's what's happening. I mean, how's that any different from what used to happen when you just throw them out the side of the town walls? I mean, that's what's happening here. Is that right? In Australia, like we're just leaving the baby to die.
That's it. So what's going on up till now? We've in the last few years had our abortion laws go up to full term. So we're going to be seeing a very interesting thing happening here because before this, these babies were right on viability. So the other thing that I heard a lot in these support groups was that these women during their delivery, they were given painkillers that were much higher than normal. And so many of their stories, and this is one thing that I was very grateful for, I chose an elective caesarean for my stillborn son. There were reasons around that. But I was absolutely cognitive the whole way through, and one of my greatest memories is him being placed on my chest, still warm. As the only time I felt him warm, the next time I held him, he was cold because he'd been taken to the fridge. But these women that are delivering a stillborn baby, and in the case of genetic termination as well, they're given much higher painkillers because they don't have to worry about it affecting the baby. And many of these women have almost no memory of their actual deliveries because they're under such heavy sedation. So part of that sedation, from what I can see from these stories, is that that sedation is actually part of also the demise of the baby.
Right. Okay. But
So
that's
it's not
that's not classified as feticide per se.
No, it's because that sedation is to mum, but it goes through her to the baby.
It gets to the baby.
Correct.
But I think in answer to your question, Senator Canavan, the fundamental point here is that there is no legal mandatory protection of these babies. So when they are born, they're not subject to federal protection of their rights. And we know that in New South Wales and South Australia, there are legislative provisions that ensure that they are protected. But we also know in other states that it's explicit in the guidelines that they don't receive life-saving treatment if that is appropriate in their individualised circumstance. And so I think that's the situation that's being brought out by this evidence, is that we just don't have that federal protection. And, you know, in my other line of work as an academic, I work around justice for temporary migrant workers. And I think this, you know, the question of like, should we leave this just up to the guidelines? I think if we had a thought experiment and thought, should we leave this just up to employers as to whether they pay the minimum wage? We don't do that. On the question of the minimum wage, or, you know, the government, Minister Giles has introduced a bill about increasing penalties on employers that exploit temporary migrants. And the reason we have these protections in the law and we have people that enforce these protections is because we can't trust employers necessarily to protect all workers and to treat them fairly because they've got a profit-making objective that might contradict with a worker. And in the same situation here, while we might have clinical guidelines in some places, and while some individual nurses, midwives and doctors may intervene to provide palliative care, we don't have federal protection. We don't have state-based protection. And the idea that a health professional who is involved in a procedure which has the intention of ending the life of a human being is then upon the moment of live birth required to switch and suddenly provide comfort care, palliative care or life-saving medical treatment if appropriate is too much to imagine, I think, for just a practitioner to be able to do in the very moments after birth, which are crucial to the protection of that infant. So, you know, I think this speaks to why we do actually need this bill to pass.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Urquhart.
Thanks very much. Look, I think you've covered on some of the areas around my question, but I'm interested in understanding your understanding of the duties that health practitioners are currently subject to in carrying out termination of pregnancy. Now, I think a lot of the witnesses prior to you guys as well has indicated that there are it's a state-to-state thing, but I'm interested to understand what your view is.
And I think it's interesting because the Marie Stopes International submission says that compassionate and guidelines exist for palliative care for babies who are born alive, and then they actually extract the Queensland termination of pregnancy guidelines. And so I think if that's the example of compassionate care, I would really be concerned, because the Queensland termination of pregnancy guidelines explicitly state that while a blanket can be wrapped around a baby, any other life-saving treatment like gastric tubes or oxygen aren't to be given. And in fact, it says explicitly no life-saving treatment should be given. So if that's the example of the ethical guideline that sets the standard for compassionate care as the MSI submission establishes, then that's highly concerning. I think the other point I'd like to share with the committee is that I have seen the Westmead coroner's report of the unnamed baby who was born alive and zipped into a medical bag, still breathing. And the coroner's report is by Janet Stevenson. And, you know, I think your question is a really good one. Like, if this was covered by the ethical guidelines and mandated through that, potentially then we could say that that's good enough. But I also do want to suggest that I'm not totally there with you, Senator, because, you know, in the employment context, I don't think we would expect industry associations to self-regulate whether workers are being paid appropriately, and I don't think we would be okay with that system. So in this situation, leaving it all up to the ethical guidelines of health practitioners who are involved in an abortion procedure intending to end the life of a child, is it enough for public confidence to ensure that human rights are protected of those babies, to leave it up to those guidelines? But in this Westmead coroner's report, what it says by Janet Stevenson, the coroner, she says there is a serious issue which arose as to the way in which this child was treated after signs of life were detected, not the least of these being the non-acceptance by medical staff that they had a duty to treat the situation in a manner different than they did. So if this was sufficiently covered by ethical guidelines, I think what we would see is Greg Kavanagh's report in the NT and Janet Stevenson's report in New South Wales wouldn't be saying these things. And what she goes on to say is, there appears to me to have been a total abrogation of responsibility, let alone common humanity, on the part of those who should have borne the burden of dealing with the child. So no one's expecting the mother who has undergone the abortion procedure to care for this child. But in a humane society that cares about justice and human rights, there should be another party that is responsible. And Janet Stevenson, Coroner Janet Stevenson, says that there was a total abrogation of responsibility about who would bear the responsibility of caring for the child, despite the presence of ethical guidelines potentially in New South Wales. And so that child fell through the gap, was zipped into a medical bag while still breathing and alive.
So can I just follow on from that and say, how do you think that practitioners apply their clinical expertise and judgment? I mean, I understand that they can provide palliative care where relevant under existing guidelines and practice, but how do you think that they apply their clinical expertise?
Look, to me, it's a little bit like saying employers can pay the minimum wage. I think that health professionals obviously do their job to the best of their ability. Like, I don't think anyone's doubting the integrity of doctors, nurses and midwives in this country. But I think without this federal protection for babies who are born alive, essentially you are expecting the medical professional who had the responsibility of ending the life of that human being to suddenly switch seconds after birth to start taking care of that human being, protecting that human being, holding that human being and providing comfort, and potentially rushing that human being to neonates to give them life-saving treatment if appropriate. And in the case of Jessica Jane, Nurse Williams, when confronted with this little baby girl who's wriggling and alive and crying with good ACPAScals, calls the doctor who ordered the abortion, who's at home, and said, "What do I do? The baby's been born alive." And he said, "So," and hung up the phone. And she then was left in a situation where she wrapped the baby in a blanket, but essentially left the baby in an empty room for 80 minutes on a metal plate without, any sort of comfort care beyond that.
So what is your understanding of the duties that would then be placed on health practitioners as a result if the passage of this bill was successful? So
I think that the duty, as stipulated in Section 9, would be to treat a baby in a way that is equivalent to any other baby that is born. So I think I've read in the submission, Senator, that people are concerned that this is going to criminalise health professionals, and we don't want to see that. But the reality is that medical professionals already have a duty of care to babies who are born, and they have to make an individualised clinical judgment at that point. So we're not asking anything more than just that when a baby is born alive and has signs of life, there's an equivalent duty of care. And the reason this bill is necessary is because at the moment these babies are falling through the gap. That duty of care is not clear.
Would anyone else any other witnesses like to add anything? You don't have to, yes, I'm just giving you the option.
I was Julie. Go for it, Julie.
Okay, thanks. I just want to read out the actual clause in the South Australian law because I think it speaks to this ambiguity very clearly that it seems to be concerning. It says...
Sorry, Ms Sharp. Sorry, Ms Sharp. Where are you? I just missed where you were reading that from, the South Australian...
Termination of Pregnancy Act 2021.
Thank you.
So it's Part 2, Division 1, Clause 7 and Paragraph 3. And it addressed this doubt. It said, to avoid doubt, the duty owed by a registered health practitioner to provide medical care and treatment to a person born as a result of a termination is no different than the duty owed to provide medical care and treatment to a person born other than the result of a termination.
Okay, so
I think that makes it kind of clear.
Sorry, that actually, sorry, it's a little bit hard doing it via teleconference because I think you've finished and you're still going. So I'm sorry if I've interrupted you, but I'm just trying to work out. So the South Australian Termination of Pregnancy Act, I think that's the way, that actually applies for South Australia now. So that actually covers the sort of areas that I think Dr. Howe was actually talking about needed to be reinforced. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, yeah, and the actual wording of it is very, very clear, and takes all the onus off of the medical practitioner to just provide the care they would normally provide for any other preemie.
Great, that's really helpful because we've heard a lot this morning about Victoria and Queensland, but that's the first time that I've heard about the South Australian Act, so that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jody, in your submission through Love Adelaide, you talk about a recommendation that babies born alive be entitled to a birth certificate and a death certificate, and then a proper burial or cremation, whatever the course may be. Do you want to take us through that? That's an important point.
It is an important point, and obviously because of my lived experience, this is a very big point, and we've thought deeply about what is going to be happening to these and what is currently happening to these children who are born not dismembered. So, up to viability, all of the procedures before that, except for the chemical abortions, are all dismemberment. So these children are in pieces and they're taken away as medical waste. But after that, they are delivered as a fully intact baby. Now, I've tried to find out and ask what is happening to those children. Are we giving them a dignified burial? I haven't been able to ascertain exactly what that is, but as far as our organisation goes, we have actually offered to be a part of a solution for this, that we would help to engage a funeral home and whatever costs incurred in that, so that these children are taken away with dignity and either buried or cremated. So as far as I'm aware, this is not happening. Now, except to say, there are two very distinct differences here. When these children are a wanted child that have been delivered from a genetic termination, those children get all of that because those parents actually have a funeral. I've attended 2 of those funerals. And so I've attended the funeral of my own infant baby. It's a horrific thing to see these little coffins. There's nothing like it. But those babies that are genetically terminated are actually treated exactly like a stillborn baby, and they're given a funeral because the parents are grieving their loss and they want their families to support them in that. But there's another whole situation of babies that don't have that. So we don't know, and I'd like it to be part of the be amended to the bill that we actually give dignified burials or cremations to these children.
Does this tie back into this observation that babies that are born alive as the result of a termination are somehow considered differently to a baby if it had been, a week and something had happened to it later on? I mean, it's a very strange scenario that the law, and there would probably be state-based provisions for the, what you're talking about, but of course this can inform that, are given a very different approach. I mean, it strikes me as being strange that, as we've seen earlier, we spoke to one of the witnesses earlier about the Queensland Criminal Code, which shows that even in the eyes of the law in Queensland, a baby is considered to be a live, viable human at birth, yet somehow, it just strikes me as being bizarre that we're even having to talk about this.
It does. I was listening to when Mr Cliff was speaking from Cherish Life, saying if we want to do what is great for equality and for discrimination, there is nothing more than to bring this across for all children to be equal and have equality. Because from my lived experience and from what we've all heard and the statistics, we've got inequality and discrimination happening across our nation.
Can I ask this question of Dr Howe in relation to, and I think Michelle touched on this just before, about the issue of the uniform laws across the country, where One of the arguments against this bill that we're proposing is that there are, of course, provisions in places like South Australia and other states, very few of them. But why is it important that there be a uniform federal position?
Yeah, look, I think that we recognise in other areas that we have to have uniform federal protection. And so in this situation where we have babies who are falling through the gap, because our criminal law federally recognises that from first breath a person has legal rights. But in this situation involving termination of pregnancy, these are babies that are falling through the gap. And so we do actually need federal uniform laws that provide mandatory protection. And if we don't have that federal law, then we do have a state and territory-based approach. And this is fundamentally an issue of equality and human rights. And so it's a situation that should be addressed through a federal law. I think irrespective of Australians' views on the issue of abortion, this bill doesn't affect reproductive rights for women. And so one could be pro-choice and support this bill. And I think we saw that in the South Australian Parliament when the amendment to protect babies born alive. There were many members of that Parliament who voted for the Termination of Pregnancy Act, but who voted for this amendment for palliative care and life-saving treatment to be given if appropriate to a baby. Because it doesn't matter whether you're pro-life or pro-choice or what your position or agnostic on the issue of abortion, because the abortion has already occurred, so it doesn't affect reproductive rights. I also refute the fact that this stigmatises abortion. I think that this is, abortion is often a distressing situation for women, and I think that this is a distressing reality of an abortion. But I think we're doing women a disservice if we lie to them and don't give them the information that this occurs. So I think that's important to say. And in terms of the statistics, I noticed that even, the Nurses Union questioned where did Senator Contravene get that statistic of babies being born alive and left to die in Queensland in their submission. And that really speaks to the lack of knowledge, even within those in the know, on this issue. And I do think that if Australians were really to know about this, and they are becoming aware, then we would see an expectation on the federal parliament that this is a parliament that stands for equality, and we do need birth equality in Australia.